Right, greetings to everyone who is watching this. And so today we look at a very interesting discussion around the role of the church in the revolution. So there's an article that I wrote about that. What I will be doing here is to speak to those issues that are in the article, but I won't be speaking directly from that article. So I would still recommend that you get a copy of that article. If you're watching on Facebook, just send a message to the Arise Black Child Facebook page, or alternatively use the WhatsApp number that's on the page to request for the article. If you're watching on YouTube, just leave a comment and you should be able to get assistance. And so when we're looking at the church, we understand that we are talking about an institution that is a very key pillar of society because it influences people's cultures. It influences the way people think and the way people live their lives. So when we talk about any revolution, whether we are talking about a revolution being a far-reaching change in the way that people think and the way that people behave, or we are talking about a revolution as an overthrowing of a government, we cannot neglect the role that is played by the church in delivering that. You know, as a major influencer in society, the church plays a very huge role. And so I will look in the African context, you know, into the role that was played by the church in the liberation struggle. Also look into where the church is today, and conclude by giving some recommendations as to what it is that I believe can and should be done, you know, for the church to play an effective role in the revolution. So the revolution, in this case, will be, you know, the emancipation of a black child, be it economically, psychologically, or politically. Um, and so when you look at the early liberation struggle, right, and it was somehow very difficult to distinguish between religious leaders and political leaders, because one way or the other, these were the same people, you know. When you look at a leader like Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, he was from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which today has about 36 million people. You look at Julius Nyerere and Thomas Sankara, who were both Roman Catholics, you know, and we know Thomas Sankara was loved so much by the priests because of his way of thinking. And his parents wanted him to actually become a priest. And so one can argue that, you know, the values that were portrayed by these leaders could have been values that were common to the people of their respective religious groups, if we understand the sort of moral impact that the church has um, on its people. But it would not be enough to only look into individuals that came from certain religious groups. We also need to look at what the church as an institution has achieved. And when looking at that, I think the first example that comes to mind, you know, is the role that was played by the church in Ghana's education sector. We understand that the Christian group, the Islamic group as well, played a very key role in building educational infrastructure and also coming up with programs and activities that would drive the education of Ghana. And you know, and these practices would then date back to um, some biblical references. And it doesn't matter whether you are a Christian or not, because when you look at the Bible, it provides us with some great deal of political history. In fact, Reverend Callisto Odede argued that when you read the Bible as literature, the Bible then becomes a highly political book. And so I would also recommend that, you know, whether you are a Christian or not, just read the Bible as literature and find out some of the political practices that are in the old Hebrew texts. And so we see from that biblical reference that, you know, um, we had leaders from the time of the judges to the kings and to the governors, and we see some very key political role players in all those different dispensations. And from David being the first king to sort of institutionalize governance, the first one to have a more structured governance body. And we look at the likes of Nehemiah being an example of a leader who is rooting out corruption and leading with compassion um, for the people. So, what we can conclude is that, from both the biblical reference and from the African historical context, is that the church did not distance itself from issues affecting the people in the society. And maybe a concern would be that, I think the same cannot be said about the church today. And as the world becomes more and more secular, we see some sort of disconnect between government and the church. So the concept of secularization divides the world into two. A world that is devoted to um, temporal things, or let me just say, devoted to the temporal world, and a second world that is devoted to the spiritual world. And so, the church has decided to cling to one of these and no longer participate actively in the other. So we see very little collaborations between the church and the government. Um, in that the way government and church relations are today is not the same as what they used to be. Rather, what we see now is the church that is always a victim of government decisions, without understanding that the church was once in a position of influence where it had enough power to be able to determine some of the decisions that are taken by government. And I'll give a few examples in the South African context that show us that there's tensions between church and government, and that sort of collaboration that we had is no longer there. There's enmity between the two. And I'll take it back to around 2018. I'll just give two examples. Around 2018, when as a response to the bizarre things that were happening in the church, government then made a proposal to say that churches should be regulated by government. And the response by the church then was to say that how can a secular government, a government that by law rejects any religious considerations, want to regulate issues of faith? And maybe one can say that that was a fair enough argument, but what shocked me was the fact that the church did not recommend an alternative of dealing with the bizarre things that are happening in the church, be it church leaders raping women in the church, be it those that are looting from the poor, and all sorts of bizarre things that are happening in the church. So it's more like the church saying that we belong to the spirit world, you belong to the temporal world. Let this gap be clear, and let there be a distinction between the two. um, and that was quite shocking for me. Not that the church um, argued against the proposal to regulate the church, but the fact that it did not come with any alternative solutions. And so the second thing that showed me that there is some sort of inconsistencies when it comes to how the church deals with government, or a secular government, was now during the coronavirus pandemic, right? That a lot of things had to close down because of the lockdown, so people could no longer congregate. There were no more gatherings allowed for obvious reasons. And it became interesting when the church argued that it should be considered as an essential service. And the first thing that came to my mind was, how did the church so soon forget that a secular government does not make any religious considerations when it makes its decisions. Although we have a right to religion and we have freedom to religion, but government decisions are not based on religious considerations. So if you want to be deemed essential, for example, because of your spiritual impact, and that has got nothing to do with a secular government. So a church that understood that a secular government to a certain extent cannot um, make considerations of these spiritual issues so soon forgotten, you know, when when it now when it now suits the church. And so for government to deem you essential, it would have to be based on your social and economical impact, as opposed to the spiritual impact that you have. And so I felt like maybe that was an unfair argument to make, understanding that the body of work of government in itself scopes within temporal boundaries. But the interesting thing in all these examples that I'm giving is that comparing the current church and the early church, I feel like, the early church would have been an essential church in these circumstances, because how can a body that is involved in farming, for example, in the education sector and in the provision of basic needs, not considered as one that is essential. And so I realized that okay, these elements are lacking in the church today, and that is why there is nothing within temporal boundaries that the church is doing that can be deemed essential to society, beyond congregating every Sunday, every Saturday, depending on whatever day people meet. There is nothing else that the church is offering politically, economically, and so on. So we know that from the early church, there were daily distributions from the church. People would get food from the church. People would seek refuge from the church. Um, and the church was directly involved in those issues. And so today it's not the case, I argue. It was Joshua Maponga who said, you know, you want to worship in a free society, but you do not want to be involved in the mechanisms that will deliver that society for you. And I feel like that is where the church is standing today. We can say that there are religious leaders and religious organizations that are still actively involved in politics, but what you notice is that there is a poverty of political ideologies um, and strategies to bring about a revolution. So one would think of, a recent example, something that I just saw in Parliament. Um, the land issue has been one that has been a hot debate for a very long time. So in 2018, a motion was moved that, Section 25 of the Constitution should be amended to look into expropriation of land without compensation. So there was an ad hoc committee that was formed to look into that. So because of the coronavirus, then the work of that committee was stopped. And now that Parliament is back on the 30th, just a week ago, um, the ANC moved a motion to say that let the committee be reinstated so that it continues with its work. And surprisingly, so parties had to vote in favor or against the motion. The African Christian Democratic Party was one of the few parties that voted against the motion. In other words, they are saying that we don't see a need for a committee to look into more radical ways of transformation, and that for me was a Christian party voting against the revolution. It was not a surprise that the DA and the FF Plus would vote against such, them being predominantly white political parties. Maybe they are not in favor of radical transformation, but to find the Christian Democratic Party as part of the people that opposed that motion was quite shocking for me. So people are not going to vote for you because you can pray for them, but what do you bring to the table? What ideas do you have to drive a revolution? And so that is where the church is today. And the current model of the church on its own is one that is anti-African. It is still highly colonized, and it has lost its moral values. When you look at the things that we do in the church, the music that we play is Western music. The clothes that we wear, the way in which we communicate, and the way in which messages are delivered in the church appears to be highly colonized, and the church continues to demonize Africanism and politics, such that for you to be a believer, you have to distance yourself from politics, you have to distance yourself from issues of Africanism, and that is how the church has sort of lost its influence in society as far as driving a revolution is concerned, because unconsciously the church is drifting people away um, from being involved in driving out the revolution. We are looking at a church today that is corrupt and lawless. The bizarre things that are happening in the church. Um, and you can say the same things that you say about political leaders. You can say the same about our religious leaders, that they are overfed and unconcerned, either because they are looting from the poor, or people are just giving freely to them because they look up to them as leaders. So the current church has portrayed a God that cares very little about his people and the issues that affect them. And so I feel like, to a certain extent, the current church is unable to purposefully drive a revolution and really affect the way people look into the emancipation of the black child, into pursuing economic freedom, because the church rather, has removed itself um, from such interests. And so it is important to look at the early church and the current church and really draw a comparison and see what is it that the church can do to claim back that influence that it had, you know. And this is important because, with the examples that I gave with the early leaders that belonged to certain religious groups, we saw that the level of morality was high, so that if the church was continuing in the same direction in instilling these values and these principles and changing the thinking patterns of its people, then we would have leaders that are driven by love and all fairness. So, for example, if I belong to a certain religious group or to a certain church, um, and there are values and morals that are instilled in me because the church is devoted to the spiritual world. When I become a leader in politics, it becomes much easier for me to lead with compassion, with love, and I would not be able to sell out the people. I would not be able to forget about the people and seek my own. And that is the key role that the church can play um, in society. Instead of driving people further away from participating in the struggle, the church can rather shape the mentality of these people to understand that leadership is about serving the people and not about seeking your own. And so I feel like we really need to go back to the drawing board and look at the influence that the early church had. So the question that I would pose, to the current church is that what is it that the church is doing in the education sector today? What is it that the church is doing in agriculture? What is it that the church is doing to deal with issues of unemployment, of youth unemployment and youth empowerment? You find that the church is really not doing much, and one can conclude that it has lost its role in society. But I still believe that, the world is hungry for leaders um, with high morals and that understand that leadership is service. And I am not saying in any way that these leaders can only come from the church. I'm saying the